Good day to you all. Welcome to this special broadcast of Energy in Africa. I am your host, Fifi Peters. This series will take a look at energy on the continent and what it will take to make the leap towards cleaner energy. Last week, we focused on financing energy development in Africa and the strategies that would be required to make it work. In today's episode, we delve deeper into the policy, the law, and the regulation. My two panelists are Mr. Ndlandla Gumere, the regulator member responsible for electricity at NERSA, as well as Professor Lwazi Ngubevana, the director of the African Energy Center at Wits Business School. Gentlemen, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to the program. Professor, can I just start with you and just like to get your understanding of what is happening, just given that we're all moving towards a just energy transition and the fact that the future is renewable. What then does this mean for the policy that will direct this future, and how compatible and suitable would you say existing policy on the table is right now?
Thanks, Fafi. Thanks for having me. I think from just where we are currently, our energy in the country is dominated by fossil fuels. And this is not only in electricity, but also in the fuel sector. Now, you've spoken about the just energy transition. Now, this is quite interesting because we all speak of the just energy transition, but I don't think we are at a point where we can clearly define what the just energy transition is, because depending on who you speak to and what their interests are, the just energy transition means very, very different things. You speak to labor, it simply means securing their jobs. You speak to business, it means ensuring the financial sustainability. You speak to government, again, it means something completely different. So it's really interesting as a conversation, I think, to be had as to what the just energy transition means. Now, when it comes to policy, I think that we are still in the building phases of ensuring a just energy transition in terms of our policy. We've got an electricity policy in terms of our IRP, which speaks of introduction of a lot more renewable energy into our energy mix, particularly into our electricity mix. But I think we do need to develop a clear framework for what a just energy transition means. And this includes the other energy sectors. In my view, we shouldn't leave them behind because they're big contributors. I mean, you look at our transport sector, it's a huge contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions. And therefore, I think we need to build an actual just energy transition policy. And this needs involvement of all stakeholders, business, public, and government. And so I think we are still at the early foundation phases when it comes to policy.
And Ndlandla, would you agree? I mean, is this transition to this more renewable and diversified energy mix as unclear to you, speaking from a NERSA perspective? And perhaps you can just talk to us also as a regulator what the move towards renewable will mean for the role of NERSA.
Thank you, Sisi. I think for me, can I maybe put it this way, that luckily for the regulator, we implement policy, we don't develop policy, and therefore there is, of course, I think the policymakers have got an unenviable position in that they have to then find and strike a balance between what the country can afford to do and what the country needs to do in this transition. So I will speak. Yes, I'll comment on the policy, but I will then hone in on what the regulator's role in that policy, in the implementation of that policy would be. So to start my comments on the policy side is that, sometimes I think there's been a great, we've forgotten the role that is played by energy in an economy. Let's take, for instance, the countries like like the Middle East, who are biggest producers of hydrocarbons, oil and gas, that their economies not only use the gas to generate electricity and to make liquid fuels for the use of the vehicles in their economy, but those hydrocarbons are actually in those countries a means of an income. The same goes to countries that are blessed with water. I'm going to quote two countries, Brazil and Norway, who have, for instance, with Norway, they had lots of water resources, which on their own are not saleable, but they had to convert that into electricity. But electricity, because it's a means to an end, and not largely an end on its own, although because they are grid connected, they can sell that clean energy to other members of the Nord Pool, is that, but in the main, the way they make money from it is that they then get all of the raw materials, including base metals like iron and aluminium, which they then smelt in their country, and then they make products from that, because energy is a means to an end. Another example would be a country like Iceland, blessed with geothermal sources, is that using those geothermal sources, for instance, they are big smelters when it comes, or big producers in terms of aluminium, because they can't sell geotherm, but they can use the electricity generated from those geothermal sources, which are clean, renewable energy sources, to produce aluminium, which is required for the making of all sorts of materials, including panels for things like, for instance, like solar panels. Now, when it comes to our country, unfortunately, South Africa is a water scarce country. We have a lot of sun. But as the sun is, it rises in the morning and it sets in the afternoon. So we need to be able to then say, harness it when it's there, use it efficiently, find ways of storing it efficiently, but unfortunately, energy storage is not cheap. But find ways of storing properly, such that you can still generate enough energy in terms of quantities, make it more reliable, but make it cost effective. Because if your electricity that you produce is expensive compared to, because we are part of this global family, if the electricity produced is too expensive, then it's clear that you will not generate, your economy will decline. So that's one part. So those are the policy decisions that policymakers have to make. Luckily for the regulator, we don't have to make those policy decisions, we implement them. So in our case, we don't make a choice in terms of the energy mix. We get told what that energy mix is, and people then apply for licenses. As long as there's a link between what they're applying for and what the policymaker has decided on, all the regulator then has to do is to fulfill the actual requirements of the Act and will grant those licenses. Mm-hmm. I'm hoping that's clear.
Very crystal, in fact. But as a regulator, you do have a role on pricing. And perhaps if we just stick within the renewable and the future of energy framework, if you can just give us an understanding about the kind of conversations that are being had at NERSA about pricing with regard to this renewable energy mix.
I'm glad you've asked the question, because most people tend to actually just look at pricing. Like, for instance, the solar energy is free. All you need to do is to have the infrastructure to harness it and generate it. But the problem with it, as I've indicated, is only available 30% of the time. Now, that is assuming that there is no cloud cover and all of the other things. Just on a normal day, it's only available 30% of the time. Now, if you had to price energy just on the basis of when the sun is up and everybody's generating electricity will be very cheap in South Africa. Unfortunately, life is not like that. You have a lot, for instance, especially in terms of residential consumers, you've got people that are using energy in the morning. We've got a morning peak, and also in terms of the afternoon peak. And also in terms of industrial users and commercial users, for that matter, some of them would want to use electricity 24/7. Steady state, good quality, without any dips and whatever. That's one part, that's base load. You also have people that wake up and businesses that start during the day and they shut down and they stop in the evening. Now, how do you price all of that energy? Because clearly the needs are different, and the generators that you use to generate that power are different. So we've generally priced everything because we're as NESA, we're regulating ESCOM. There was only just one ESCOM. We had generally lumped all of ESCOM's cost into one and came up with what you called an average wholesale price. Clearly, that past is gone. People are seeking to generate electricity for themselves, and also because of these variable energies. For instance, the example I like using is that for people who might be on solar during the day when they have when the sun is up, they either have to themselves invest in energy storage, and then when the sun sets, to then tap that energy that they themselves have stored and use that. Or alternatively, if they want the grid to then support them, that is when the sun sets and they want to come back to the grid, they're expecting that the grid would have sufficient capacity for them to actually come back to the grid. They need to pay for that, because clearly somebody sits there without generating any power, have to have plants that are available when, as the sun sets and everybody comes back to the grid, that this capacity needs to ramp up. Now, how do you price that? You can't price it. You can't have somebody that's been sitting on the grid the whole time and funding that capacity in the grid continuously, being charged the same amount when as somebody who then occasionally comes back when their primary mode of production has actually run out. Now, that is biggest the challenge. How do we price that? So the world has changed, and NESA is adapting, is changing its pricing philosophy from one of average prices to one that recognizes this reality and be able to then say, those that, for instance, want to use the grid purely as an emergency measure, that is, either they can then have their own generator, which is a standby generator, but if the grid is going to be used as a standby generator, then it needs to be priced accordingly, because that capacity is, somebody has to pay for it. I'm not sure if that part is clear as well.
Yes, sir. Thanks so much. At least it also clarifies the understanding of the complexities that will potentially be involved in pricing the future energy resources. But Professor Lwazi, just to come back to you, and perhaps if we even just take a step back from the future and just look at the present, as you rightly said, the continent, South Africa as well in that mix, very heavily dependent on coal presently to power itself. But in South Africa, if we just stay here for a moment, we have also seen quite a number of changes in the energy landscape happen over the past 12, 18 months or so. Perhaps the most recent being the announcements regarding self-generation and the increasing with the limitations there. But we're also still in the middle of watching the transition, as it were, of our state power utility that used to essentially do everything and now is in the process of being unbundled into 3 units. What then, or how then, would you describe the existing policy framework and the effectiveness thereof?
All I can say is very much like Mr. Komete, I do not envy the policymakers. The industry is in flux. You've mentioned the unbundling of ESCOM. We're in a state of building a gas master plan to try and support the transition from coal to cleaner fuels. We've got, like I said, the amendment of Schedule 2, and this is quite complex. I really do not envy the policymakers, but also don't envy the regulator when it comes to making these decisions, because now you're getting to a point where you've got consumers becoming prosumers, in that they produce and they also want to sell into the grid, but they also want to consume from the grid. And this is made for quite a complex environment. But I do think we've got capable leaders in this space to make the correct decisions. I do think that we are blessed with very strong policymakers. In terms of where we are, we have already made the right strides in allowing for consumers to, self-generate up to 100 megawatts. But I think for me, what's really important here is, at least with that step, is to how do we ensure that we can actually implement this policy? Because one challenge we're going to have is, for example, the registration process with NERSA. We need to make sure that doesn't become a bottleneck in implementing this policy, because I think there's huge potential for many consumers to come on board. Also, how do we capacitate the municipalities, for example, who are going to buy this energy? How do we make sure that they can actually sign these power purchase agreements, these wheeling agreements? For me, I think that's really the main concern, and not necessarily the policy itself. I think that the policy space is now opened up to allow for that. I think also, in terms of small scale embedded generation, that's, the individual household or, really, really small factory. How do we get these people to participate in the transition? How do we price this right to ensure that there's incentive for those small players to come into the space? But I do think that we've got very capable people to handle this. I think the policy space itself is good, but we need to now ensure that we can implement it.
All right. Maybe if we just get a comment from you, Ndlandla, just regarding the implementation process and what has been done at the regulator to ensure that when the registrations and the applications for licenses do come to your door, that there aren't bottlenecks that stifle the process from operating effectively.
Well, luckily for us, we are actually, before the announcement, we had also embarked on a process of reviving NERSA. We've gone through a process of 3 or 4 months of developing our strategy, in which one of the couple of the things that stand out there are, one, the issue of us needing to actually improve regulatory efficiency. By regulatory efficiency, basically, it's about us looking at the processes, mapping them, and then re-engineering them. And also taking out some of the things that traditionally we may have done, but either were not empowered by the law, or that perhaps they may not add value. So that is on the regulatory efficiency side. To give effect to that, we had actually changed our mission statement, our policy, our purpose statement, from one of controlling entry into the market to one of facilitating entry. So you will find that it may not be happening today, but as the months roll out, you will find that the staff are going to be giving effect to the actual objects of the Act, because the Act was about saying, if somebody needs to apply for a license, for instance, the regulator needs to engage with that person and assist the person to the extent to which it provides what materials, what things it needs, and the form in which it needs them, so that by the time the person makes an application, they know exactly what the regulator requires. So we are in the process of doing that. Registration on its own had simplified the process in the sense that, unlike licensing, registration is merely just, if you like, collection of data, just to also make sure that for instance, whoever wants to go into the grid has spoken to the grid owner. They have an agreement with the grid owner. Grid owner has said, I have the capacity to actually take this, what we are going to produce. So that agreement needs to be there. And also the regulator needs to know who is making power where, because at the end of the day, as a regulator, we're also entrusted with grid stability. Therefore, we need to know that for the demand that's there is enough supply or potential supply. So that's one of the things that we're looking at. And then maybe the other part, which I thought I'll add to, is that one of the things that we are changing is what we call systems and tools. Clearly, if we are just regulating one player, ESCOM, which generates, which transmits, which distributes, and maybe just sells to other people, also owns its own distribution network, although the municipalities may also own their distribution networks. But in the main, ESCOM has been the actual dominant player. So if we're moving from regulating just one player to regulating a multiplicity of players on the generation in the generation space, well, we can only have one transmission company, but have multiplicity in terms of distribution and also allowing trade, because the issue that's raised by Prof here is that people that are actually generating, they're saying, I want to be able to sell to one or more players, in which case you need to have, whilst ESCOM was this bigger player and the municipalities were traders and everybody else was reselling based on those traders, we're going to have to open the space. That's what this new dispensation is asking for. So the licensing dispensation itself has to accommodate that. And as NASA, we are in the process of reforming all of that.
Okay. Professor Lwazi, I'd just like to circle back to some of your opening comments. So perhaps one of them just being the fact that we are still in this position whereby we are developing this framework that will enable the just energy transition. And you did mention the importance of having all stakeholders on board for this. I'd like to ask you then, what then needs to be the ingredients to ensure that the framework that is developed is one that works for everyone, is one that works for labor, is one that works for the private sector by channeling a lot more investments in the sector, and is also one that works for consumers by enabling them to have access to electricity at an affordable cost?
Thanks, Fifi. Look, the way I see it, this is an economic policy challenge. It's not necessarily an energy challenge. Yes, energy is obviously an economic driver, big economic driver. Now, we need to make sure that policy decisions are inclusive, right from the beginning. We have to make sure that there is consultation. And in fact, I think the way we are now, where we are, we need to ensure that we consult way beyond what we've ever done before, because this has an impact not only today, but into the future for our children or grandchildren. Because, for example, should we decide to embark on a acquisition process of a particular energy type, and that's expensive, it could, the impact of that could be long lasting, 50, 100 years and even beyond. And so we need to make sure that we are consultative. We need to ensure that as we transition, we safeguard and grow the economy. We've got to ensure that we take labor on board, but also not just labor, but our communities as a whole. We need to ensure that this transition includes the average man on the street. It includes the community organizations. We need to have conversations around how do we get these really small groupings to get involved in not only participating in the projects as recipients or beneficiaries, but also as active economic participants. So if, for example, you've got a mining area, and you're thinking of doing land redistribution, how do we ensure that we use that redistribution process as a catalyst for the just energy transition? Whether it be encouraging farming for, let's say, for bioenergy, and make sure that the communities are involved in the ownership and not just participating as labor. So I think we really need to have a very broad and very honest participatory process, and not rush it through just to serve, let's say, industries' particular purposes. This is about the future of our country.
Just on your point of inclusivity, Professor Lwazi, the space is also seen as one in which, you will need a lot of money to really scale up, and it's one in which perhaps large companies will have an advantage. But also, as we do drive towards creating a more inclusive and sustainable environment, it is one in which smaller players will have to be involved, and particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. What then, as we do try and build these ingredients of an effective policy framework. What then, in terms of lessons, can we draw from the mining sector when it does come to empowerment credentials, whereby you have government that is trying to empower a lot more people, but you've also got the private sector that says we've done our empowerment, we've ticked the boxes, and if those that we empower choose to sell out, we can't be put at a disadvantage for this?
Yeah, that is a tough one. Look, unfortunately, I think our mining sector, as well as they've tried, but we do not have a great track record, in my opinion, in terms of empowerment. I think that we've had a top-down approach to empowerment. We haven't really gone to ask the communities what it is that they want, what it is that they, how they want to participate in these assets. And like I said, it's not just about bringing people in and making sure that they benefit from jobs. They need to actually own the assets. And by own them, I don't mean debt. I mean actually own the debt and the asset. And this is something we really need to do very differently. I think there's huge number of community organizations, cooperatives that we have left out. And I think we need to bring them on board. I think there's a lot of capital there. South Africa has got a very unique way of doing things. I mean, if you think of the stokvel industry, it's billions and billions of rand that's circulating in the economy. We need to make sure that we harness those kind of funds to ensure that people actually own these assets and are fully involved in the running of the businesses. Then this will avoid the situation you're talking about of the mining industry saying, we've done what we can. If people want to sell out and move on, well, then there's nothing we can do. I think that if you get people truly involved and not just sitting and reaping the benefits of, some shareholding, sitting with a dividend or whatever, I think if they're fully invested, then we're going to see a real change.
To the both of you, I'd like to thank you for your time. We will leave it there. That was Mr. Nhlanhla Gumede, the regulator member responsible for electricity at NERSA, and Professor Lwazi Ngubevana, the director of the African Energy Center at Wits Business School. And that does bring this episode of Energy in Africa to a close. Thank you so much for watching. We'll do it again next time. Goodbye.